Hey there. Come a little closer to the fire. Honestly, I have always found it strange how politely we tell ourselves the story of beginnings. We call it progress. We picture a neat staircase, from caves to cities, from clay huts to towers of glass. But if you listen carefully, history does not climb. It circles, it forgets, it breaks. And the quiet parts between the breaks are where the truth likes to hide. Tonight I want to share a darker kind of comfort with you, not a fairy tale. Something that smells like wet clay and cold stone. A story that begins in a trench cut into the earth, where a man brushed dust from a wall and realized the ground itself was trying to say, very softly, that we are not the first. A clean layer of clay, laid down by ancient water, with no pottery in it, no tools, no fire ash, nothing human at all. And beneath that silence, different people, different bowls, different hands, like a page torn from a book, and the next chapter written by strangers, kings in old lists who are said to have ruled for impossibly long spans, tens of thousands, like time was measured differently before the flood, and a thin, dark boundary in the ground that some say holds the fingerprints of fire from the sky, a sudden cold, and a vanishing of animals and cultures as if someone blew out a candle. If you find peace in this kind of darkness, you can leave a like or subscribe, just as a small sign in the night. Now, let your shoulders sink, let your jaw loosen, take a slow breath in, and let it out like a long sigh you did not know you were holding. Let the fire keep watch so you do not have to. And let me take you back, carefully, to winter. It is 929, near the ancient city of in southern Iraq. The air has that surprising bite, the kind that slips inside your sleeves and settles on your skin. Sir Leonard Woolley stands beside a narrow excavation trench. His boots press into packed soil, and when he exhales, you can almost see the breath and then lose it, as if the morning itself is swallowing evidence. If you were standing here with me, you would hear the small noises first, the scrape of a trowel, a soft cough, the faint rattle of canvas, a distant call that might be a bird or a man. Even the wind sounds different inside a dig site, like it is careful not to disturb the layers. Woolley has already seen treasure, golden helmets, lapis lazuli beads, blue as deep water. The royal cemetery has given up its dead, not only kings and queens, but servants laid beside them, as if still waiting. There is tragedy in that, but it is a tragedy wrapped in ceremony, almost tidy. Yet the thing that shakes him is not gold, it is clay. At first, it looks like nothing. Earth is earth. But archaeologists learn to see the differences the way you learn to recognize someone's footsteps in a hallway. Woolley leans in and senses a wrongness, a pause, a place where the past should be busy with human leftovers, and instead it is blank. The trench is narrow, the walls straight, shaved by careful hands. Light falls in a slant, and you can see dust floating in it, tiny grains turning slowly as if time has become visible. Woolley climbs down, one boot, then the other, steadying himself with a hand on the wall. The wall is cool, not wet, but holding a memory of moisture the way stone does in winter. In the layers above, the story has been readable. Pottery shards, a sprinkle of charcoal from old hearths, bits of bone, a world that ate and laughed and threw things away. But now the layers change. Suddenly there is a stratum of clean, water-laid clay, 8 feet, 10 feet. In some places, more. No artifacts. No sign of a cooking fire. Nothing. Just smooth, dense deposit. The kind floodwater leaves when it settles and finally grows still. I always get a little cold when I imagine that moment, not because of the winter air, but because of the implication. Floods happen. Rivers are restless. The chill comes from the way this clay slices the human story in two. Above it, people. Below it, people, but not the same. Different pottery, different habits, different hands shaping the same mud into different curves, as if someone erased a neighborhood and built another on top without ever telling the new residents the names of those who came before. Woolley later interpreted it as a great deluge. It was tempting, maybe irresistible, to tie it to old sacred stories. Later work suggests multiple floods rather than a single catastrophe, and still, the discontinuity remains. The boundary means an ending, a reset. Think of the clay itself as a hush, a silencing blanket. Water moves in its own rhythm. It does not hate you. It does not love you. It does not even notice you. It rises, and when it retreats, it leaves behind what it carried. It leaves behind the smoothness of a world temporarily emptied. In Woolley's notes, and in the records now kept in archives, the evidence accumulates. Pottery styles change abruptly. Architectural traditions shift. The way people organize their lives transforms. You can only see it when you take time, when you compare, when you let the ground contradict your expectations. And the pattern does not belong only to Ur. Across the Near East and beyond, archaeologists find disruptions. Layers where cities burn, layers where houses are abandoned, layers where tools change quickly, as if a whole training tradition snapped. Civilizations rise, flourish, then fall, and the survivors, if there are survivors, carry fragments forward like embers hidden in a pocket. The Sumerian King List speaks in the language of myth, but points toward something like memory. It says, kingship descended from heaven. It lists rulers before the flood, with reigns so long they feel like they belong to another world. After the flood, the numbers shrink, still strange, still inflated, but shrinking, like the world is settling into a tighter, more familiar scale. Some scholars argue those long reigns are symbolic or coded. It is debated. We cannot be sure. And I like that uncertainty, not because it is convenient, but because it is honest. The past, when it is very old, rarely gives clean answers. It gives hints. It gives patterns. It gives that feeling when you wake from a dream and cannot quite remember the plot, only the mood. Now the story tilts. Because if we set myth beside the earth and we look for alignments, there is a possibility that makes the candlelight seem dimmer. What if human civilization, in some form, has restarted more than once? Not only empires trading places, but something deeper, a cycle, worlds ending, worlds beginning. And what if we are simply in the latest turn of that wheel, walking on a floor built over forgotten rooms? To explore that, we step much farther back, to the end of the last ice age, around 12,800 years ago. Something changes, not slowly. Something changes with devastating suddenness, and the land keeps the mark. Geologists talk about a boundary layer from this time, sometimes called the black mat. Picture it like a line drawn through sediment, a gentle bruise in the earth. In and around that layer, some researchers report unusual materials, nanodiamonds, tiny carbon crystals that form under extreme pressure and temperature. Proponents link them to an impact, perhaps a comet, fragmenting, raining energy into the atmosphere, igniting wildfires, darkening skies, shocking climate systems into sudden cold. The younger Dryas cooling begins, and in some records temperatures drop with startling speed. Stay with me at that boundary layer for a moment. I know it sounds technical, but down in the quiet, it becomes simple. A line in the dirt, a change in color, the kind of change your body understands without vocabulary, the way it understands the moment a room cools when a door opens to night. Imagine kneeling at a dig site at dawn. Your knees press into soil that holds yesterday's heat and last night's chill at the same time. You scrape gently, and the line appears. Not dramatic, just definite. Now imagine what a line like that means to the people who lived through it. A spring that comes late, cold lingering like a guest who refuses to leave, herds arriving at the wrong time, or not arriving, hunger making conversations shorter, Even if the cause remains debated, the feeling of disruption is real in the record. Something shifts, something breaks, life rearranges itself, and then Göbekli Tepe, not as a headline, but as a place you can almost touch. Limestone has a bright mineral scent when it is freshly cut. Picture hands pecking stone with stone, tap by tap, dust rising in pale puffs, coating lips, sticking to sweat. A pillar falls free with a thud you feel in your ribs, and the long work of moving it begins. Ropes biting into palms, feet sliding on gravel, a slow communal breath, bodies leaning together, nudging the world into a new shape. When the pillars stand, the carvings catch the light. Fox, snake, scorpion, a message pinned to rock so it will not drift away. And later, the decision to bury it, baskets of soil, reed handles cutting into skin, dirt thumping softly against stone, the carvings disappearing inch by inch, covered, not erased. You do not bury something you feel nothing for. You bury what you want to keep close, even when you cannot keep it in sight. Somewhere inside that act is the same shiver Woolley felt at Ur. There is an ending. There is a beginning. There is a layer of silence between them. Let that image settle. Soil over stone, clay over memory, breath slowing in cold air. In the dark, it can feel like loss. In the dark, it can also feel like mercy, a way of putting something precious down gently, so it will still be there when another set of footsteps comes searching. And if your mind starts to race, just return to a small detail, the grit under a boot, the faint smell of candle smoke, the quiet rhythm of your own breathing. History can be heavy, yes, but you do not have to carry it tonight. But then, the quiet counterpoint. Other scientists challenge these findings. Misidentification, ordinary wildfire processes, dating problems. The debate itself becomes part of the story, a reminder that the past is not a single voice. Still, even skeptics often concede that something major happened, a disruption that coincides with extinctions of mammoths and mastodons, saber-toothed cats, giant sloths slipping out of the record. The Clovis culture in the Americas vanishes at roughly the same moment. A coincidence, perhaps, or a shared consequence of a changed world. You know that feeling when you reach for something that should be there, but your hand finds only air? That is how the record feels at times like this. Presence, then absence. And then, in a village called Abu Huraira in Syria, researchers found materials in sediment layers dating to this period that some interpret as evidence of extreme heat, melt glass, unusual proxies. Again, it is debated. Again, we cannot be sure. But the possibility is enough to make you consider what it would be like to live through a world that changes its rules in a single generation. If there was an early society, perhaps not agricultural, but organized, capable of gathering in large numbers, capable of watching the sky with care, what would it do after such an event? How would it remember? This is where Göbekli Tepe enters like a whisper. On a hill in southeastern Turkey, there are massive T-shaped pillars carved from limestone, arranged in circles, decorated with animals and symbols. The labor required to quarry and move those stones, without metal tools, without wheels, implies coordination. It implies purpose. Some archaeologists even suggest the desire to build such monuments may have pushed people toward agriculture, not the other way around. And then the site is deliberately buried, filled in carefully, as if someone wanted it preserved or sealed. We do not know why. We can guess, but we cannot hear the voices of the people who lifted the last baskets of soil and watched the carvings disappear. When I picture that burial, I picture hands covered in dust, shoulders aching, breath coming out in slow clouds. I picture the hush between shovelfuls, the stones growing dim as soil rises around them, not destroyed, just tucked away like a secret. The thought that we might be heirs to survivors, to people who watched their world end and then tried to speak to us through stone, is unsettling and oddly comforting. Unsettling because it suggests fragility, comforting because it suggests persistence. We may call ourselves modern, we may call ourselves advanced, but the earth under our feet, layered with clay and dark boundaries and buried sanctuaries, invites a quieter thought. We are walking on someone else's endings. And in the next part, I want to linger with you at the edge of that first great boundary, to feel the chill of the younger Dryas in our bones, and to listen for the way memory turns into myth when people have no paper to hold their grief. The night always feels a little deeper after we admit that endings can hide beneath our feet. So let us return to that question we left hanging in the air like smoke. What kind of people build monuments before farms, before metal, before the neat categories we use to keep prehistory in tidy boxes? I like to imagine approaching Göbekli Tepe slowly, as if you are not sure you are allowed to be there. The hill rises gently from the surrounding landscape, not dramatic, not jagged, just persistent. The way a thought can be persistent when you are trying to fall asleep. The ground underfoot is dry, and yet it carries the memory of wetter seasons, a faint softness in places where rain once sat. You step on small stones and they click together, a quiet music that feels almost polite. The air smells of thyme and dust. If you brush your hand along a low shrub, the oils cling to your fingertips, sharp and clean, and for a second the scent is brighter than the moonlight. Somewhere in the dark there is an insect making a steady sound, and if you listen long enough you realize it is not one insect but many, all keeping time in their own small way. It is easy to forget, in a modern world full of engines, how loud silence used to be. Silence had texture. It had layers. Now, picture the enclosures, circles of stone, pillars rising like paused figures. The most famous ones are shaped like a T, broad shoulders, narrow body, as if they are people turned into geometry. Some have arms carved along their sides. Some wear belts. Some carry foxes and snakes in their surface, as if the animals are both warning and companion. You stand close to a pillar, and you can see the marks of the tools. Not metal, just stone on stone. Patient abrasion. The limestone is pale, but where hands have touched it over and over, it would have darkened slightly, polished by skin, by sweat, by breath. I always think of breath here. Hundreds of breaths, thousands. The air inside the circles thick with it during gatherings, warm bodies exhaling into cold evenings, voices murmuring, then singing, then falling quiet again. The practical questions arrive like moths to candlelight. How did they feed themselves while they built this? How did they coordinate the labor? How did they convince people to keep showing up, day after day, season after season, to drag stone that did not directly become food? There are answers, or at least possibilities, and I want to offer them gently, the way you offer a blanket. Some archaeologists describe these builders as hunter-gatherers, but that phrase can sound too small, too thin. Hunter-gatherer makes you imagine a few people drifting through a landscape, always on the edge of hunger. Yet coastal plains and river valleys can be abundant. Wild cereals can be harvested. Gazelles can be driven. Fish can be taken in predictable runs. A community can gather at a sacred place and still return, again and again, to the same life-giving roots. And there is another thought that feels almost intimate. Perhaps they gathered because they were frightened. You know that feeling when something changes in your life and you cannot explain it, but you sense that the old rules are no longer reliable? The sky does not feel the same. The seasons are off. The elders tell stories with a new tremble. In that kind of uncertainty, humans do what humans do. They gather. They make meaning. They build something solid. Something that does not melt or rot. Something that can hold a message when mouths and memories fail. If the world had recently been shaken by sudden cold, by ecological collapse, by fires or floods or both, then the urge to carve memory into stone makes a quiet kind of sense. Not proof, we cannot be sure, but sense. Klaus Schmidt, the excavator most associated with Göbekli Tepe, once described it as something like a sanctuary. And sanctuary is a good word. It implies refuge. It implies a place you go when you want to be smaller than your fear, when you want your fear to be contained by walls and rituals and shared breathing. I imagine a night gathering there. The wind is cool. A fire crackles in a shallow pit. The smoke rises, then flattens under a low sky and drifts among the stones, turning the carvings into moving shadows. Someone holds a torch, resin burning, the flames steady but alive. The fox carved on the pillar seems to blink as light shifts. The snake seems to slide. A child presses close to an adult, not because of cold, but because the darkness has stories in it. Words are spoken. Some are practical. Some are prayers. Some are simply names, spoken slowly. The way you speak the name of someone who is gone, so they can be present for one more breath. And then, much later, the sanctuary is buried. We talked about it before, but I want to slow down again, because this is where the story becomes very human. It is one thing to build. It is another thing to cover what you built with your own hands. The soil they used was not clean clay like Woolley's flood layer. It was debris, rubble, fragments of tools, bones, the leftovers of years of gathering. Each basket carried a small archive, and as it was poured in, the space changed acoustically. Sound softened, echoes died. The enclosure became muffled, as if it was being put to sleep. You can almost hear the last moments. Someone stands at the edge and looks down. The pillars are still visible, but lower now. The tops catch moonlight, pale against darker soil. Maybe there is a ritual. Maybe there is nothing but tired silence. Someone clears their throat. Someone coughs. Someone laughs once, an odd laugh, then stops. Then the work continues. It is tempting to romanticize this. I try not to. The truth may have been mundane. Social change, environmental change, migration. The sanctuary no longer needed or no longer safe. Yet even mundane reasons do not erase the tenderness of the act. To bury is to accept that you are leaving, and leaving becomes the theme of the next catastrophe in our sequence. Because after fire, after sudden cold, there is water. Not a single dramatic wave, not 40 days of rain, but something slower, more cruel in its patience. Sea levels rise. At the peak of the last glacial maximum, the ocean sat far lower than it does now. Picture the shorelines stretched outward, exposing wide plains. Places that are seabed today were once grassland, marsh, river, mouth, home. If you have ever walked on a beach at low tide and felt the strange firmness of wet sand, imagine that sensation extending for miles and miles. A broad world of mudflats and reeds and shallow channels. A world where people could live because water and food met in the same place. Now imagine that world drowning. Not all at once, but by degrees that add up. Sometimes I try to picture the sea level rise not as a graph, but as a sound. A soft, repetitive hush at the edge of camp. One more wave licking the reeds. One more line of dampness creeping up a wooden stake. Salt in the air where yesterday there was only river scent. You wake in the night and hear water moving in a way that feels closer, and you tell yourself it is nothing. Because admitting it is something would mean admitting you might have to leave. The sea does not rush you. That is the cruel part. It gives you time to hope it will stop, time to bargain, time to build a new hearth a little farther back and pretend it is temporary. A generation watches the water creep closer. A grandparent points to a stone they remember as far inland, now lapped by brackish waves. Children play where their parents once gathered shellfish, and by the time those children grow old, the place is gone. Burial grounds, campsites, sacred rocks. The practical route to a fishing spot, all of it slipping under the surface, quietly, with the indifference of physics. This is what I mean when I say the earth has layers of silence. Water creates silence too. It covers, it muffles, it preserves in some places, and destroys in others. In the North Sea, there was Doggerland, a low-lying region of marshes and lakes that once connected Britain to continental Europe. It was a country that existed for thousands of years and then vanished. People hunted there, gathered there, lived there, and centuries later, when trawler nets scrape the seabed, you can almost feel that old world snagging on modern metal. A net comes up heavy. The crew hauls, hands slick with spray. Among seaweed and shell and dark mud, there is a worked flint blade, edges still sharp enough to catch a fingertip. Someone rinses it, watching the water run gray. For a moment, the boat is quiet, as if everyone senses they are holding a message from a place that no longer exists. And as waters rose, they retreated. Fishermen, in modern times, still pull up traces from the seabed, worked flint, carved bone, sometimes even human remains. It is a haunting kind of archaeology, because the artifacts come up wet, darkened, as if they have been sleeping. In the Persian Gulf, too, there was dry land. Rivers ran through what is now shallow water. The combined waters of the Tigris and Euphrates flowed farther south than their present mouths. If you close your eyes, you can imagine a broad valley, green in places, a corridor of life between harsher zones, a place that would have attracted people, because rivers always do. And then, beginning around 14,000 years ago, the flooding starts. It is slow enough to be argued about, fast enough, in pulses, to be felt. There are meltwater surges where sea levels jump meters over centuries, even over decades, in the most dramatic reconstructions, enough for a community to look at the horizon and feel a twist of dread. NASA and other researchers have traced these pulses through coral records and other evidence. The numbers can feel abstract, but the human experience is not abstract. It is walking to the edge of your familiar world and realizing it has moved. You know that feeling when you return to a childhood street and something is gone, a house demolished, a tree cut down, and your body reacts before your mind can make sense of it? Multiply that by an entire coastline. No wonder flood stories persist. No wonder they cling to the human tongue. In Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh tells of Utnapishtim, warned of a deluge, building a boat to save his family and the seed of living things. Later traditions echo it. The biblical Noah, other regional tales. Some scholars argue these are literary borrowings. Others suggest they reflect universal responses to flooding. And some propose that, at the core, there is cultural memory, distorted but persistent, of a world that drowned over generations. I find the generational aspect more believable than the single catastrophe. A slow drowning allows for survivors. It allows for debate, for ritual responses, for the building of stories over time. It allows for children to grow up hearing the water described as a curse, and then to become adults who watch the curse continue. Imagine a community relocating inland. The move is not heroic. It is practical. It is heavy. People carry what they can, and they leave what they cannot. Someone looks back once, then stops looking because it hurts too much. They settle on higher ground and build again, using the same hands, the same instincts, the same fears, but in a new place. Perhaps that is how certain cultures seem to appear suddenly in the archaeological record, not out of nowhere, but out of water. The Ubaid culture in southern Mesopotamia, for example, shows up with sophisticated pottery and architectural traditions that feel surprisingly mature. It is tempting to say they emerged. It may be more accurate to whisper they retreated. Refugees, descendants of coastal populations displaced by rising seas, carrying templates of temple plans and pottery styles, like seeds in a pocket. At Eridu, Temple after temple is built, stacked over time, each following similar orientation, as if a memory is being honored. 17 temples, one on top of another. A slow repetition that feels like a prayer you keep saying because you are afraid to stop. And here, gently, we circle back to Woolley, to the flood clay at Ur, a flood layer in a trench, a drowned world under the sea, a sanctuary buried in soil, different peoples above and below a boundary, the same motif repeating in different materials, clay, water, dust. If your eyes are getting heavy, let them. If your breathing is slowing, let it. You do not need to hold every detail. Let the story hold you instead, the way sediment holds a fragment of bone. In the next part, we will move from the long drowning into a different kind of betrayal, a betrayal by the sky itself, when the rains fail and whole settlements shrink. The 8.2 kiloyear disruption that turned thriving places into quiet ruins. We will follow the survivors toward rivers and springs and listen for how scarcity reshapes the human heart without ever raising its voice. You can almost feel it before anyone names it. A change in the air, a small hesitation in the season, a morning that should have been mild but arrives with a thin edge of cold, and later a summer that should have carried rain but holds back, like a hand half closed. You know that feeling when the world seems to forget its own schedule? When you keep checking the sky, and the sky keeps answering with the same blank face? This is where our story drifts next. Not with the drama of fire from the heavens, not with the long swallowing patience of the sea, but with something that sounds gentle until you live inside it. The rains do not come the way they used to. Around 8,200 years ago, the North Atlantic system stumbles. Ice cores from Greenland, those long cylinders of time pulled from frozen silence, record a quick drop in temperature. Not a slow cooling you might not notice, but a fall that happens within decades. A few degrees, perhaps more in some reconstructions. Enough to shorten growing seasons. Enough to make a field of grain look thinner. Enough to turn a dependable spring into a worried conversation. Tree rings in Europe and North America narrow in those years, as if the trees themselves are holding their breath. Lake sediments in the Near East show signs of dryness. Dust rises more easily. Water levels fall. Streams that once spoke steadily become quiet, then intermittent, then strangely absent for stretches that feel too long. Some scholars describe the trigger with a kind of cold clarity that makes my skin prickle even as I sit by the fire. Glacial lakes, immense bodies of meltwater trapped behind ice, finally break their barriers. Agassiz and Ojibwe, names that sound like places you could visit, but in those millennia, they were inland seas. When the ice dam gives way, the fresh water pours into the North Atlantic through Hudson Bay, disrupting ocean circulation. The conveyor of warmth slows. The climate system, which is always moving and balancing, loses its usual steadiness. It is debated how precisely each region felt the shock, how severe it was everywhere, how direct the links are between climate proxies and the everyday lives of people. We cannot be sure. And still, the pattern in the archaeological record has a particular sadness. Settlements shrink. Sites are abandoned. A remarkable experiment in early village and town life falters. If you were standing with me at the edge of one of those communities, you might not notice it at first. You might just feel the nights staying colder longer. You might notice the sheep looking lean. You might notice the wild grains ripening unevenly. You might notice your own mood changing. Not dramatic, just sharper around the edges, the way people become when they do not sleep well. Jericho is a good place to pause, because Jericho feels like a heartbeat in early human history. Imagine it in the early Holocene, not the tourist image of ruins, but a living settlement. The air would have carried a mix of scents: damp earth near irrigated patches, smoke from hearths, animal musk, crushed herbs on stone, people moving through narrow spaces, voices layered, children darting between adults, dogs barking, then settling. And then there is the tower, a stone tower rising from the settlement, massive for its time, built around 8,000 BCE in some chronologies, 8.5 meters tall, 9 meters across. Not a casual project, not something you build on a whim. It requires planning, coordinated labor, food to feed workers, a shared sense that this structure matters. The purpose remains debated. Defense, ritual, astronomical observation, status display. I have always found it strange that one structure can invite so many interpretations, and perhaps that is the point. The tower is a mute witness. It does not tell us why. It only tells us that humans were already capable of gathering their effort into stone. Now, imagine living in a world where such projects are possible, and then watching conditions tighten. Ain Ghazal in Jordan offers another glimpse. A settlement that may have housed thousands, spread over many hectares, a density approaching a small, modern town. People there created plaster statues, nearly a meter tall, with delicate faces, wide eyes, a kind of frozen attention. When you look at those statues, even in museum light, you feel the human urge to preserve presence, to keep someone or something from disappearing. And then, around 6,200 BCE, many places across the Levant and Upper Mesopotamia show disruption. Occupations thin. Some communities shift location. Some are abandoned. The change is not a single day of panic, but a process of stress. Rain-fed agriculture depends on a rhythm, seeds in soil, the expectation of moisture, the timing of sprouting. A reduction in rainfall by even 20% can be devastating when the margin between surplus and hunger is narrow. 50% is a cliff. In layers at Catalhoyuk, researchers have looked at residues on pottery, chemical signatures that can hint at rainfall patterns. In some studies, elevated deuterium to hydrogen ratios suggest drier conditions in the period associated with the 8.2 event. Again, the details are complex and debated, but the overall picture is consistent with hardship. The human body responds to hardship in quiet ways. Diet changes first. People eat different animals, different plants, not because they suddenly prefer them, but because the old staples are unreliable. Children grow with subtle signs of stress. Adults become thinner. Illness takes hold more easily when the body is already tired from hunger. And the social fabric, which is always woven from abundance as much as from belief, begins to fray. Competition for remaining resources becomes sharper. The tone of disputes changes. What was once a shared field becomes contested. A spring becomes guarded. A path becomes watched. Sometimes the conflict leaves marks in the record. Sometimes it does not. Human tension does not always burn cities. It can also simply push people apart until a place is empty. I picture a family deciding to leave. Not heroic, not cinematic. A decision made over days, perhaps weeks. They notice the grain store is lower than it should be. They notice the goats are eating bark. They notice that the elders speak less, as if saving breath. One evening, after a small argument over a bowl, the mother goes quiet and stares toward the darker horizon. The father pretends not to see. The children sense it anyway. They pack what they can. A few tools, a pot, a skin bag for water, maybe a small carved charm, a handful of seeds they hope will still matter somewhere else. The morning they leave, the air is cool and dusty. Their footsteps make soft sounds on hard ground. The settlement behind them keeps breathing, but it feels different, like a body that has lost weight. They do not look back too many times. Looking back can make you stop. Some people do not leave at all. They adapt in place if they can. Those near permanent water sources have a better chance. Those living near rivers, springs, lake margins. Those in upland areas where topography catches moisture. Those who can shift toward pastoralism and move herds to follow rain. Survival is never evenly distributed. It is selective. like a quiet hand choosing, and over time, the pattern reshapes the map. Populations concentrate along major rivers. The Tigris, the Euphrates, the Nile begin to matter even more. The idea that later civilizations are river civilizations is not just preference. It may be memory, a learned lesson, written into settlement patterns by catastrophe. When we look at the period after the 8.2 event, we often notice a contrast. Smaller settlements, less elaborate architecture, artistic traditions diminished or absent. It can feel like a setback, a loss of complexity, and it is. Yet it is also a kind of resilience. People choose what can be carried forward. They choose what keeps them alive. The rest, even if beautiful, gets left behind. If you have ever decluttered a room after a difficult year, you know this feeling. You hold objects and realize you cannot keep everything. You choose essentials. You let go. There is grief in that, and also relief, the way an empty shelf can feel like a breath. Now, let the image of those abandoned places grow soft in your mind. A wall half collapsed, a hearth cold, dust settling on a floor where someone once sat and told a story, a doorway open to wind. And let the wind carry us farther south and west, to a landscape that once was green. Because the next catastrophe is not only drought, it is a whole world changing its identity. A savanna turning into desert. A place of lakes and cattle and stars becoming the Sahara we know. Vast, bright, and unforgiving. In the next part, we will walk into that transformation, slowly, listening to rock art that remembers swimmers in water where there is only sand now, and following the refugees toward the Nile, carrying knowledge like embers across a drying world. Before we move on, I want to linger a little longer in the feeling of that 8.2 moment, because it is so easy for our minds to treat it like a statistic. 8.2, a number with a decimal, a label on a chart. But for the people living through it, the crisis would have been made of hours. A dawn when you wake, and the air has that sharpness that makes your throat feel slightly dry. You step outside and there is dew on the ground. Yes, but the dew is thin, reluctant. The sun rises, and you can almost watch the moisture vanish. A child asks for water sooner than usual. An older sibling pretends not to hear, because the answer hurts. You walk to a spring you have known your whole life. The path is familiar in your feet. You could walk it in darkness, guided by memory. Yet, as you approach, you hear less. The usual sound of water, that steady murmuring that can comfort you even when you are far away, is quieter. When you kneel, your knees press into dirt that feels warmer than it should. You cup your hands. The water is there, but it does not fill your palms as quickly. It slips away. It seems to hesitate, as if deciding whether it truly belongs to you. I have stood beside springs in dry regions, and honestly, there is a kind of humiliation in seeing how small the gift is. Water looks innocent until you realize you are dependent on it. Then every drop feels like a decision the world is making about you. In a village like Catalhoyuk, where houses were built close and people moved across rooftops, imagine how the atmosphere in those rooms would change. Clay walls hold the day's heat and release it slowly at night. When nights become colder and days become harsher, the walls feel different against your skin. The plaster cracks more easily. Smoke lingers lower because the air is heavier. You begin to notice the smell of stored grain turning slightly sour, a hint of fermentation that is not celebration, only worry. You know that feeling when a pantry is almost empty and you start doing quiet arithmetic with your eyes, counting without speaking, measuring with silence. People would have tried rituals. Of course they would. When patterns fail, humans speak to the unseen. They sing. They leave offerings. They watch the stars, which keep their ancient calm. Some would swear the sky is angry. Some would argue that the sky cannot be angry, that it is simply the sky, and the arguing itself becomes another form of heat in the community. And then there are the small, practical adjustments. gathering farther from home, hunting smaller animals because the larger ones have moved, grinding different seeds, using more of the plant you used to discard, boiling bones longer to pull out every last trace of fat, taking turns watching storage pits, teaching children not to waste, in voices that are gentle but edged with fear. A storyteller in that world might sit near a hearth and keep the mood light, not because they do not understand the danger, but because they do. They know that panic burns energy you cannot spare, so they speak slowly, warm words wrapped around dark truth. In a way, that is what we are doing now. So when we say a civilization collapsed, I want you to feel the softness of that word. Collapse is not always walls falling. Sometimes it is a gradual forgetting, a loss of skills because the skilled die without apprentices, a loss of patterns because the seasons refuse to cooperate, a change in what stories are told because the old stories no longer fit the world. And that, perhaps, is the deepest darkness of climate disruption. It changes what you expect from time itself. Now, let your mind ease again. Let the images blur slightly at the edges. Dust in sunlight, a thin stream, a roofline against a pale sky, the slow exhale of a hearth as it cools. And then, as if turning a page made of clay, let us step into a different vastness, a land that once held water enough for people to swim, and cattle to drink, and birds to gather in reeds, a green Sahara, waiting to be remembered just before it dries. The Sahara was not always a word for emptiness. I know that sounds like a simple fact, but sit with it for a moment, the way you might sit with a warm cup between your hands and let the heat climb slowly into your fingers. The Sahara, the great bright desert that seems eternal in photographs, once held lakes. It held rivers. It held grasses that moved like green water under wind. It held herds of cattle and people who followed them, and children who learned the taste of milk under a wide sky. The evidence is not subtle. It is carved into rock. In the central Saharan massifs, in places like Tassili Niger in Algeria, the Tadrat Akakus in Libya, the Tibesti and the Enedi in Chad, there are images painted and etched into stone walls. Tens of thousands of them. They show elephants, rhinoceroses, hippos, crocodiles, fish. They show people swimming, arms lifted, bodies curved in water. It is almost painful to look at those figures when you know the same stone now bakes in heat, surrounded by sand. You know that feeling when you find an old photograph of a place before it changed, before the tree was cut down, before the river was diverted, before the building was built? There is a tenderness in it, and an ache. The rock art feels like that, except the time gap is not decades. It is millennia, deep time, made visible. For a while, during the early and middle Holocene, the African monsoon reached far north. Orbital changes in Earth's tilt and wobble, the long, slow geometry of our planet's dance around the sun, strengthened summer rains. The Sahara breathed in water. Vegetation grew. Vegetation held moisture. Moisture fed more vegetation, a feedback loop that made the land generous. Then, slowly, the geometry shifted again. The monsoon weakened. Rains retreated southward, and the change was not only gradual. Climate models suggest tipping points. Vegetation loss reduces evaporation, reduces local moisture, reduces rain. Less rain kills more vegetation. The loop flips from green to brown to bare. Honestly, I have always found it eerie how a system can look stable right up until the moment it isn't. Like a person who seems fine until they suddenly are not. Like a crack in plaster that is invisible until the light hits it at an angle. And then you cannot unsee it. For the people living there, this transformation would have been experienced through seasons. A dry year, then another. A lake that shrinks, exposing mud that smells sour and metallic. Fish trapped in shallows. Birds arriving and leaving sooner. Grass that does not return as thick. A calf born weaker. a child coughing from dust that rises easier now. And then the conversations begin. Quiet at first. We should move the herd earlier. The well is lower. That spring used to last all summer. The elders remember wetter times and tell stories about them. The young listen, half believing, because it is difficult to imagine a world you have not personally touched. Yet the evidence keeps piling up like sand on a threshold. One of the most haunting sites is Nabta Playa in the Egyptian Nubian desert, west of Abu Simbel. Today it is a place of arid openness, the kind of landscape where sound travels far and then disappears. But thousands of years ago, there were seasonal lakes there. People gathered. They watched the sky with careful attention. They arranged stones. A stone circle, a line to mark the summer solstice sunrise, sits like a quiet clock face on the ground. Nearby are megalithic alignments that point to star rise points or to other celestial markers, depending on interpretation. It is debated exactly how precise the alignments are and whether they served practical, seasonal purposes, ritual meaning, or both. Still, even the attempt tells you something about the mind of the builders. They were measuring time, not just the time of a day, but the time of a year, the time of return, the time when rains should come, when cattle should be moved, when people should gather for ceremony. Their knowledge was not written on clay tablets. It was written into arrangements of stone and into habits of watching. Now imagine the cruelty of watching those patterns fail. The solstice still arrives. The sun still rises where it should. The stars still turn. The sky keeps its promises. The earth does not. As the Sahara dried, lakes like Megachad shrank from near inland sea size toward what we know today. Other lakes vanished entirely, leaving salt flats, dry beds, ghost basins. Pastures failed. The water table dropped. And the people faced a choice that is as old as our species. Adapt, migrate, or perish. Migration sounds simple until you imagine it in detail. A family cannot carry their entire life. They must choose what becomes memory and what becomes burden. Picture a group preparing to leave a seasonal lake margin. The morning is still cool, because deserts can be gentle at dawn, and the coolness makes the coming heat feel like a secret. They pack hides, tools, small bundles of dried food. They tie loads to poles. The cattle are restless. You can hear their breathing, that warm animal breath that smells of grass and perhaps just a keepsake, and hesitates. She has held it through many seasons. She does not want to leave it, but she also does not want to carry it if it slows her steps. She tucks it into a pouch anyway, because some things are worth the wait. Children do not understand the full meaning. They know only that the adults are quieter and that the direction of travel feels final. A boy looks back at the lake, smaller than it was, glinting like a coin in the light, and tries to memorize it. He does not know why. He just feels the urge, as if his mind senses it is about to lose a picture forever. They begin walking. Footsteps press into sand and hard crust. The sound is soft, granular. Fabric flutters lightly against skin. Sweat forms and then dries almost immediately, leaving salt that itches. The sun climbs. Shadows shorten. The horizon shimmers. When they stop to drink, the water tastes slightly of leather and dust, and they drink anyway. When they rest, they sit in sparse shade, and the silence around them feels enormous, as if the land is already practicing being empty, and still they move. Many streams of people, over generations, moving toward where water remains reliable. The Nile is the great receiver of this migration, a single permanent artery through an increasingly arid body. The valley draws refugees, the way a lit window draws insects at night. It promises life. It also promises crowding. Archaeological surveys suggest increases in Nile Valley settlement density in the late 4th millennium BCE, before the unification of Egypt. It is debated how large the Saharan contribution was, whether it was substantial replacement, gradual admixture, or smaller pulses over time. Ancient DNA is beginning to clarify pieces, but it is a complex puzzle. Still, the cultural echoes are tempting to follow. Cattle symbolism, for instance, the sky goddess Nut, sometimes depicted as a cow spanning the heavens. Royal imagery steeped in cattle motifs. The importance of herding knowledge. If you have lived in a pastoral world, cattle are not just food. They are time and wealth and ritual and identity. They are the rhythm of the day, the reason you know the land, the reason you watch the sky. Astronomical knowledge. 2. Clear desert skies teach you constellations with a kind of intimacy. When you sleep in open land, the stars are not decoration. They are company. They are a map. They are a calendar. The idea that such observational traditions could flow into Nile civilization feels plausible, even if we cannot draw a straight line. What is clearer is that environmental catastrophe does not destroy knowledge completely. It relocates it. It scatters it. It forces it to travel in bodies and in stories. People arriving at the Nile would have carried memories of water that used to be abundant in the West. They would have carried stories of lakes that died, of sacred stones left behind, of ceremonies interrupted. Those stories could shift, soften, become myth, become metaphor. A tale of a land that turned to sand in punishment. A caution that rains can leave. A sense that the world has moods. And as those migrants settled, they would have had to negotiate with those already living along the river. There would be marriages, conflicts, alliances, the old human processes. The dark side of migration is that it can strain the places that receive it. Fields must feed more mouths. Water must be shared. Power structures shift. New leaders emerge. Old leaders harden. Yet out of that pressure can come the organizational patterns that later look like civilization. This is one reason I do not like to romanticize collapse. Collapse is not only loss, it is also a rearrangement that can produce new forms. But the cost is written in bodies, in fatigue, in grief. It is written in the way a child learns fear without knowing the word. Let us return, briefly, to the rock art, because it is a kind of whisper from the green world. The images progress. Early scenes show wild fauna of a wetter Sahara. Later scenes show cattle and herding. Later still show horses, then camels. The pictures themselves narrate desiccation, as if the stone is keeping a diary of drying. And then, one day, there are no more paintings, no more gatherings, no more swimmers. The land has become too harsh for the old life. The fourth catastrophe, in this framework, is not a single event, but a biome death. A world turning its back on the people who loved it. A savanna turning into desert within a few human generations. As we let that sink in, notice how your mind reacts. Perhaps it tightens. Perhaps it imagines heat and thirst. If so, soften the image. Make it gentle. Picture the night instead. In the desert, night can be cool, almost tender. Stars sharp as salt. A small fire. People huddled close. The smell of smoke and milk. The hush of a sleeping herd. They tell stories, because stories are a way to carry water when water is scarce. And those stories travel with them to the river valleys, where the next chapters of recorded history will be written. Chapters of temples and kings and cities. Chapters that will, in time, face their own droughts, their own collapses. In the next part, we will move into a later age, when the Bronze Age world, interconnected through trade and ambition, finds itself strained by drought again. Fire and sword and failed harvests, woven together. For now, let the Sahara fade softly behind your eyelids. Let the sand become a quiet blanket of time. Let the stars keep turning, patient and cold, while human footsteps drift toward the sound of the Nile. If you have ever walked for a long time in dry air, You know how the body becomes a metronome. Breath, step, breath, step. The mouth dries first, then the lips. The tongue feels thicker, as if it has absorbed dust. You start to notice the weight of your own eyelids. You start to measure distance, not in miles, but in how many sips of water you have left, and how long you can keep the children calm before their fear becomes loud. So imagine generations doing this. Not one caravan, not one dramatic exodus. A slow, repeated retreat, like a tide in reverse. Each year, a little farther. Each decade, another familiar watering place abandoned. Each century, a map rewritten. At Nabta Playa, when the seasonal waters failed, the stones would have remained. Stones are loyal in a way living things cannot be. They do not leave. They do not adapt. They simply wait. The people might have touched them one last time, palms flat against rough surfaces warmed by sun, and felt the grain of the rock under their fingertips, a texture that could anchor memory, a promise that something had been true here once. Then they would have turned away, and the wind would have moved through the empty space between stones, making a faint sound, not quite a whistle, more like a long exhale. Sand would begin to gather in corners, as sand always does, patient, methodical. When those migrants finally reached the Nile, the experience would have been almost overwhelming. Water, not as a shy pool, but as a moving body, a river with weight and voice, the smell of wet reeds, the coolness near the bank, the green. After so much beige and ochre, I always imagine a child standing at the edge, staring, not speaking, because words would be too small. A child who has known thirst, now hearing water move, and feeling both mercy and danger in the same sound. People learn the river's moods. They learn where it rises, where it leaves silt, where it hides crocodiles. They learn how to time planting to its pulse. They learn new rituals for a new kind of water. And somewhere in their storytelling, the old world of western lakes becomes a dream, a place that existed before, a place that ended, a place that might return only in myth. Let that image rest, soft and steady. The Bronze Age world liked to think of itself as solid. Cities rose from river plains like careful geometry. Walls, granaries, temples, docks, markets where copper and tin and lapis lazuli changed hands under awnings that snapped softly in the wind. Messengers moving along dusty roads with tablets wrapped in cloth. Boats gliding in reed-thick channels. A sense, almost a superstition, that the whole machine would keep working because it had worked for so long. You know that feeling when your daily routine becomes so dependable that it starts to feel like nature, not like a fragile agreement. That is what complex society does to the human mind. It makes us forget contingency. It makes us forget that the harvest can fail, that a river can behave strangely, that a trade partner can vanish. Around 4,200 years ago, something begins to tighten across wide regions. A drought, severe enough that modern stratigraphers recognize it as a marker in the Holocene record, the beginning of the Megalayan stage. But that is a modern label, cool and neat. For the people living through it, it would have been a slow choke. Winter winds linger longer. The Shamal season in Mesopotamia stretches out, dry and dusty, like breath scraped through cloth. Fine particles settle on skin, on bread, on the surfaces of clay jars. You wipe, and the dust returns anyway. The sky takes on a pale, drained look. Clouds appear thin, and when they do gather, they seem reluctant to give anything back to the earth. In northern Mesopotamia, where rain-fed fields once carried wheat and barley without irrigation, the margin disappears. Soil dries. The top layer powders. Seeds sprout unevenly, then stall. Herds range farther for grazing and come back thinner, ribs showing like the curved lines on a pottery jar. Archaeologists would later find some of this in the ground. At Tel Leilan, in northeastern Syria, excavators described wind-blown dust accumulating in streets and rooms that had been kept clean just years earlier. It is such a small image, dust in a street, yet it tells you almost everything. Maintenance stops when people leave, and people leave when staying becomes a slow death. The city does not burn. There is no dramatic layer of ash that makes a clear story. Instead, the place simply empties, and the wind moves in, taking over with a quiet authority. Dust drifts into corners. Doorways fill. The silence becomes thick. Harvey Weiss and colleagues argued that this abandonment coincided with the onset of the drought, and soil samples showed increased dust, suggesting erosion from landscapes that had lost vegetation cover. Some debate the exact causes and timing, as scholars always do, but the pattern of abandonment across the rain-fed zone is difficult to ignore. Fields that once fed cities become unreliable. Granaries cannot fill. Taxes cannot be collected. Armies cannot be provisioned. A state is, in a practical sense, this is where the Akkadian Empire enters the scene like a figure in lamplight. Sargon of Akkad, rising from obscure beginnings in later tradition, forged what many call the first true empire, stretching influence from the Persian Gulf toward the Mediterranean. The administration standardized measures, managed provinces, kept records. It was a marvel, the kind of thing that makes humans believe they have finally mastered the chaos around them. And then the rain fails. The empire's strength becomes its vulnerability. Integration means dependence. Northern fields and southern canals, mountain timber and desert routes, tin from far away and copper from nearer sources. When one region falters, the strain runs along the network like a tremor. I want you to picture the daily life of an administrator in such a world. He wakes before dawn in a room that smells faintly of clay and old smoke. He rubs sleep from his eyes and feels grit on his fingertips, dust that found its way in overnight. He dresses, tightening a belt, adjusting a small seal that marks his authority. Outside, the air is cooler, but it is dry in a way that makes the throat feel narrow. He walks through the city as it stirs, hearing the soft clatter of pots, the low murmur of waking households. At his office, perhaps a small courtyard with benches, scribes arrive with tablets. They press reeds into wet clay. They read out numbers, deliveries expected, deliveries missing, grain short, complaints from villages, requests from soldiers, a sense of pressure building, but still contained by routine. Then a messenger arrives from the north, dusty, eyes reddened. He speaks quickly, then stops, as if his own words frighten him. Another settlement has been abandoned. Another canal has silted. Another group of pastoralists is moving south, not as invaders in the old sense, but as hungry people following grass that no longer grows in their home range. The administrator feels his pulse quicken. He forces his face to remain calm. He must. Panic is contagious. He tells the scribes to record. He tells a guard to fetch water. The water tastes slightly of silt and salt. He swallows anyway. This is how collapse begins, not with a trumpet, but with paperwork that stops making sense. Across central Mesopotamia, texts speak of the repeller of the Amorites, a defensive wall built to stem influx, climate refugees pressing against political borders, an image that feels uncomfortably modern. The Gutians, described in Sumerian texts with contempt, appear as a force of disorder, whether they were the primary cause or a symptom, whether they were outsiders or simply highland groups under pressure. The result is clear in the stories. Roads become dangerous. Trade falters. Authority shrinks. In Egypt, the river system offers some buffer. But even there, the Nile can betray. The Old Kingdom, the era of pyramid building, fractures around 2150 BCE. Failures of the Nile inundation undermine the centralized state. Texts from the first intermediate period describe famine, disorder, people moving, officials losing control. There is a line attributed to a provincial governor, Anktifi, carved in his tomb, describing hunger so severe that people ate their own children. We should read such statements with caution. Tomb inscriptions can be self-serving. Hyperbole can be a tool of power. Still, multiple sources agree that the period was hard. Hunger is not imaginary when bodies thin and graves fill. I always think about the quiet moments of famine, the ones that never get carved into stone. A mother splitting a small piece of bread into thinner pieces, trying to make the act look fair. A father pretending he has already eaten. A child chewing slowly to make the taste last. The sound of wind outside, carrying sand against a wall. The smell of cooked grain, faint, and the way that smell can make your stomach clench with both hope and sorrow. In the Indus Valley, cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa decline over time. The population shifts eastward, toward regions with more reliable monsoon rainfall. The causes are complex, involving changes in river courses, climate variability, social factors. We cannot simplify it to one drought and one collapse. Yet it fits the larger theme, climate stress reshaping where people can live and how. And far away in China, the story flips in a strange way. The Liangzhu culture in the Yangtze Delta had sophisticated jade work and water management, and some research suggests their collapse coincided with exceptionally heavy monsoon rains and flooding that overwhelmed hydraulic systems. Excessive rainfall in one region, drought in another, both part of a period of global volatility. The planet does not choose a single mood. It distributes its disruptions unevenly. So the fifth catastrophe, in this framework, is not one single blow. It is cascading failure. Drought triggers famine. Famine triggers migration. Migration triggers conflict. Conflict triggers political breakdown. Trade networks break. Specialized production collapses because specialists cannot eat. A city can survive a bad year. It struggles to survive a decade of bad years, and it cannot survive when the stories that hold it together begin to feel false. Picture a marketplace that once felt endless. In good years, it is loud. You hear merchants calling. You smell spices, sweat, metal, smoke. You see baskets of grain, piles of dates, jars of oil. You hear the clink of weights on scales. Children weave through legs. Dogs sniff for scraps. In bad years, the same place is quieter. Fewer voices. The smell changes. Less spice, more dust. The baskets are smaller. The faces are tighter. People look at each other differently, with suspicion, with calculation. A rumor passes like a shadow. Another caravan never arrived. Another mine is closed. Another village is empty. And then, one day, the market does not open at all. Or it opens, but there is nothing to trade. In the archaeological record, such transformations can look like a gap, a thin layer of dust, a shift in pottery style, a reduction in building complexity. In human life, it is grief, stretched over time. Still, survivors persist. They retreat to smaller communities. They shift to pastoralism. They move toward rivers that still run. They carry what they can: techniques, myths, habits, a few tablets, a few songs, a few patterns of counting and measuring. The seed of the next age. If you listen carefully, you can almost hear the thread of continuity, faint but unbroken. It is in the way a later city aligns its temple the same way an earlier one did. It is in the way a story of flood or drought keeps returning in different languages. It is in the way humans keep building, even after they have been proven wrong about permanence. Let the Bronze Age fade softly now. Let the dust settle. Let the last light of a torch in an empty street shrink to a dot and then to nothing, because the next catastrophe is quieter still. It leaves fewer ruins. It does not always burn cities or empty granaries in a way we can see. It happens in bloodlines, in inheritance, in the invisible math of ancestry, and it shapes the people who will build the civilizations we remember as ancient history. Let me slow it down, because collapse is usually told too quickly, as if it were a single afternoon. Picture the edge of a field at the end of a growing season. The stalks are shorter than they should be. The heads of grain feel light when you rub them between your fingers. A farmer kneels, and his knees sink into dust that used to be soil with moisture in it. He tastes a kernel, not for flavor, but for promise, and his mouth goes dry with the answer. He walks home slowly. Each step makes a faint crunch, the granular sound of earth breaking apart. When he reaches his doorway, the shade smells of stored grain, but the smell is thinner now, as if the room itself knows it is becoming empty. In the city, the granary keeper feels the change in his own body before he sees it in the numbers. The bins are lower. His footsteps echo in a way they never used to. When scribes mark deliveries on tablets, the numbers shrink, a little less from one village, a little less from another, until the trend begins to pull the whole system downward. Trade begins to feel unreliable. A caravan that should arrive does not. Wells along the road turn bitter. Pack animals weaken. And the metals, those precious bones of the Bronze Age, become harder to obtain. Tin is distant. Without it, bronze tools and weapons shift in quality, and confidence, that invisible resource, begins to thin. People reach for meaning. In temple courtyards, incense smoke curls upward in thin ribbons, and for a moment it feels like communication. Offerings are promised. Names of gods are spoken with careful rhythm. Sometimes a localized rain arrives, and belief brightens. Sometimes nothing happens, and belief turns brittle. Then social order frays in small ways. A neighbor takes more water than his share. A young man joins a migrating group because staying means watching siblings starve. An older man refuses to leave because leaving would mean admitting that everything he built was temporary. By the time wind is depositing dust in empty streets, the decision has already been made in thousands of hearts. People choose survival over permanence. They step away from walls and markets, carrying only what they can, and the land, once left, begins its slow work of forgetting. Still, survivors persist. They retreat to smaller communities, or follow herds, or cling to rivers that still run. They carry what they can. A few habits of measuring, a few techniques of building, a few stories about how the world can change. The seed of the next age travels in their mouths and hands, not in monuments. Even when a city goes quiet, the human thread does not. It only becomes harder to hear. Listen to the hush they leave behind. It is in the record. There is a kind of darkness that does not announce itself. No smoke, no shattered walls, no mass grave that future archaeologists can point to and say, "Here, this is where the world ended." Instead, the change hides in something you cannot see with your eyes at all. It hides inside the body, carried forward as gently as a lullaby. Geneticists, using modern tools that feel almost like magic, have noticed a strange pattern in the deep past. Roughly 5,000 to 7,000 years ago, the diversity of Y chromosome lineages, markers, passed from father to son, appears to collapse across large parts of Africa, Europe, and Asia. Meanwhile, mitochondrial DNA, passed through mothers, does not show the same bottleneck. It is an unsettling asymmetry. If you imagine family trees as rivers, this would be like watching many male streams dry up while female streams continue to flow. Not because women were untouched by hardship, but because whatever shaped reproduction and survival in that period disproportionately narrowed the lines of fathers. The early interpretations sounded brutal. Clan warfare in patrilineal societies. If all men in a clan carry similar Y lineages, then when warfare wipes out a clan, it wipes out a lineage. Women captured or absorbed by victorious groups bring mitochondrial diversity into the winners, but do not add new Y lineages. Over time, Repeated conflicts could reduce Y diversity dramatically. Some modeling studies suggest this is plausible. Other scholars emphasize that the figures sometimes mentioned, a ratio like 1 reproducing male for every 17 reproducing females, reflects effective population size, a statistical abstraction, not a literal census of living bodies. Still, the pattern points to a major transformation in social organization, and perhaps in violence, and perhaps in inequality. It is debated, and it should be. The past is not obligated to be simple. More recent work has proposed that extreme warfare is not required. Patrilineal organization alone can accelerate genetic drift. When men stay in their natal groups and women marry out, lineages become clustered. Over generations, random fluctuations can eliminate some lineages more quickly than in bilateral systems. Add in processes like the splitting of clans, migration pulses, differential reproductive success, and you can get a bottleneck without imagining a continent covered in war. Honestly, I find this both comforting and eerie. Comforting because it offers a less violent explanation. Eerie because it suggests that enormous demographic shifts can occur without a single dramatic event, just through the slow machinery of social structure. And social structure is a kind of invisible architecture. We think of walls and temples as architecture, but kinship rules, inheritance patterns, who lives with whom, who marries where, who controls resources. These are also structures. They shape the future as surely as stone does, and they can change as suddenly as the climate can. Picture a settlement in the late Neolithic, somewhere on a river plain or in a pasture edge. The houses are made of mud brick. The walls feel cool in the morning when you touch them. Smoke from the hearth clings to the ceiling and blackens it over time. Outside, animals stir, the sound of hooves on hard ground, the soft snort of breath in cold air. A child grows up watching men gather in the evenings, speaking about herds, fields, boundaries. He hears the names of ancestors repeated like a litany. He learns that identity is tied to a line, a male line. He learns that land belongs to that line, and so do cattle, and so do obligations. Women, in this system, often move. They marry out. They carry skills with them. Pottery methods, songs, rituals, recipes, ways of soothing babies, ways of curing small illnesses with herbs. Women are vectors of cultural continuity. Men are vectors of territorial continuity. Now imagine competition intensifying, for reasons that might include climate stress, population growth, changing technology, the spread of pastoral mobility, the rise of elites, a dispute over grazing, a dispute over water, a dispute over a bride price, a dispute over the right to use a path. These disputes can remain small until they do not. A single spear thrown in anger can become a feud. A feud can become a raid. A raid can become a cycle. If warfare is part of the explanation, it might not look like armies and banners. It might look like night attacks, small groups moving quietly, taking cattle, killing a few men, leaving women and children to be absorbed or to flee. That kind of violence can erase Y lineages efficiently, while leaving enough survivors for the community to persist in some form. If inequality is part of the explanation, it might look even quieter. An elite male, or a small group of elite males, control resources. They have multiple partners. They father more children. Over generations, their lineages expand while others shrink. This can happen without obvious catastrophe, just as a consequence of power. History offers examples of extreme reproductive success, but we do not need a famous conqueror to make the pattern. We only need a system where a few men have disproportionate access to reproduction. And if the drift explanation is part of it, the bottleneck could be the statistical shadow of social organization itself, a slow narrowing produced by patterns that people experienced as normal. Whatever the mechanism, the implication is that the populations after this bottleneck are not exactly the same as the populations before. The The change coincides with the spread of patrilineal pastoral societies across Eurasia, with shifts in material culture, with the rise of new language families that dominate later history. The archaeology shows new patterns, new burial customs, new tools, new settlement arrangements. The genetics adds a second line of evidence, suggesting demographic upheaval. It is tempting to imagine this as a sixth catastrophe, not because a meteor fell or a sea rose, but because identity itself was restructured. The way humans related to kin, to territory, to inheritance, to violence, changed. And from that change, the early Bronze Age kingdoms and the civilizations we know by name begin to appear. Sumerian city-states in the early 3rd millennium BCE develop writing, monumental architecture, administration. Egypt unifies. Under early pharaohs, the Indus cities reach their urban peak. Chinese Bronze Age cultures emerge along the Yellow River. These civilizations rise on demographic foundations that may have been laid during this narrowing of male lineages. The social structures that produce bottlenecks may also produce the ability to mobilize labor, to concentrate power, to build temples and record taxes. The same patterns that narrow ancestry can narrow authority into the hands of fewer people. I have always found it strange and a little sad that what we call civilization often comes paired with hierarchy. The tower and the temple are beautiful. The human cost of building them is harder to see. Now, take a slow breath with me. As you inhale, imagine the air in a museum archive, dry, cool, smelling faintly of paper, dust, and old leather bindings. Somewhere in such archives, scholars keep excavation records, king lists, tablets. Somewhere in modern labs, scientists read sequences from ancient bones, letters of DNA that outlast names. We are, in a way, surrounded by ghosts. The Sumerian King List, one of the earliest historical documents, speaks of kingship descending from heaven, of rulers before the flood, with impossibly long reigns, tens of thousands of years. After the flood, reign lengths drop toward numbers that begin to feel more human. Scholars have argued about what those numbers mean. Dynasties, not individuals. Mathematical symbolism, astronomical coding, mythology, plain and simple, we cannot be sure. Yet the structure of the list matches a human instinct to divide time into ages and to imagine that something ended and something began. The flood boundary Woolley saw at that clean clay layer with no artifacts, becomes a physical echo of this instinct, a line in the earth, like a line in a story. When you put the evidence together, carefully, with humility, you begin to see why some people like the provocative framing. We are the seventh, not as certainty, not as a boast, more like a lamp held low over a complicated map. 6 major disruptions, 6 transformations, and then our current world. Cosmic impact debated. Sea level rise, the 8.2 climate event, the Sahara drying, the 4.2 drought and Bronze Age collapses, the Y chromosome bottleneck, and social restructuring. Whether these count as civilizations in the way we usually mean the word is a matter of interpretation, but the pattern of disruption is real enough to make the skin tingle. A reminder that human life is always provisional, always dependent on systems larger than us, and myths across the world echo that pattern. Hindu traditions speak of cycles and manvantaras, Hopi stories of previous worlds destroyed by fire, ice, flood. Aztec accounts of suns ending in jaguars, hurricanes, fire, water. Norse Ragnarok followed by renewal. Chinese legends of floods tamed by Yu the Great. These parallels do not prove that ancient peoples remembered specific prehistoric events. They may reflect universal psychology. They may reflect diffusion. They may reflect the simple truth that disaster is common and memory likes patterns. Still, When you hear these stories side by side, you begin to feel a kind of deep time resonance, like hearing the same melody played on different instruments. And here we are, listening in the dark, by a fire that is real and yet also symbolic. Our own age hums with interconnection, global trade, digital archives, satellites, supply chains, efficiency, speed, dependence. The Bronze Age collapsed partly because interconnection bred fragility. When one region failed, the network carried the failure outward. Modern civilization is more connected by orders of magnitude. The same feature that makes it powerful makes it vulnerable. Some people build seed vaults in cold places. Some build archives meant to last. Some talk about asteroid detection, about climate resilience, about preserving knowledge in formats that do not require electricity. These are modern versions of carving memory into stone. Yet so much of what we know lives in servers, in clouds that are really warehouses of machines. If the machines go quiet, the knowledge becomes unreadable, like a language without a speaker. This thought can be frightening if you hold it tightly, so let us hold it softly. Let it be a slow, calm awareness, a reminder to be humble. Our ancestors survived. They adapted. They carried embers through darkness. They rebuilt from small, stubborn beginnings. They found water. They learned new seasons. They made new stories. We are their descendants, and we are also their echo. In the next part, we will return to the beginning, to Leonard Woolley in his trench near Ur, and to the flood layer that feels like a physical breath between worlds. We will stand at that boundary and listen, and we will let the clay, the clean, sterile clay, tell us what it can and what it cannot. For now, let the idea of lineage become gentle in your mind, not as statistics, not as arguments, but as the simple truth that countless lives led to you, a chain of warm hands passing something forward, even through catastrophe. And here you are, safe in your room, listening, breathing, while deep time turns slowly outside the window. If you were standing here with me, by this quiet fire, I would show you something small, not a treasure, just a thin shard of a clay tablet, the kind that fits in the palm. You would feel its weight, surprising for its size. The surface is rough, with tiny ridges where a reed once pressed wet clay into wedge marks. Cuneiform. It looks like patterned gravel until you remember that it is language, memory, baked hard. I have always liked how honest clay is. It does not pretend to be eternal. It just lasts, if luck and soil are kind. This is why I say, gently, we can't be sure. A king list can be read as history, myth, propaganda, ritual. A genetic pattern can suggest war, inequality, drift, migration, all tangled together. We interpret, we argue, we revise. That is not weakness. It is respect for the darkness between the facts. And still, even in uncertainty, a lesson emerges. Redundancy saves threads. When one region fails, another carries a fragment forward. When one line ends, another continues. Someone teaches a child to shape clay, to count grain, to watch stars, and that small act becomes a bridge over catastrophe. As you breathe, rest on that image, one hand guiding another, quiet, steady. This is how the story crosses darkness, and you can drift. Tonight, let us return to the trench, not because it is dramatic, but because it is quiet. A narrow cut in the earth, boards shoring up the sides, lantern light trembling against damp clay. Winter in southern Iraq can carry a cold that surprises people who imagine only heat there. The air bites lightly at the knuckles. Breath shows faintly. Woolley, careful and patient, stands with his team and listens to the sound of tools, metal against packed sediment, the soft scrape of trowels, the occasional tap that means someone has met a hard-earned clue. I have always found it strange that archaeology feels like both creation and mourning at once. You make a hole, you reveal, you bring up what was hidden, and yet every layer you lift is a layer you can never put back. The past is generous, but it is not renewable. It offers itself once, and then it is gone, changed by your attention. Woolley's trench had already given gifts: royal graves, golden helmets, jewelry with lapis lazuli, blue like deep water under moonlight. The bones of attendants placed to follow their rulers into death. Even those discoveries, heavy as they are, come with a kind of ceremony. The soil yields them slowly. The living handle them with gloved hands and careful voices, as if the dead can still hear. Then the clean clay appears. No pottery, no charcoal, no accidental shard, just sterile, water-laid clay, 8 to 11 feet in thickness, like a long-held breath in the earth. You can imagine the flood that placed it, but the clay itself does not tell you whether it was one single deluge or many episodes of waters spreading out, settling, returning again. Later analysis suggests multiple floods rather than one biblical event. That matters if you are building an argument. Yet even if the flood came in pulses, the effect on human lie, because above the clay, one kind of life, below it, another. Pottery styles shift abruptly. Architecture changes. The pattern is what unsettles. A discontinuity, a boundary line. If you were standing here with me, in that narrow trench, you would feel the temptation to tell a simple story. One flood, one reset, one world washed clean. The mind loves clean lines, but the earth is rarely so tidy. What we can say is that something changed. A lot changed. Enough that the people after are not quite the people before. At least, not in the way they made things, built houses, organized days. Woolley interpreted that as civilizational succession. Modern archaeologists are more cautious with language. Still, the impression remains. One world ending, another beginning. This is the seed of the seventh framing. 6 times, in one interpretation, the human story was forced into a new shape by catastrophe, by water, by climate, by dust, by social transformation. And now, we stand in our own age, listening to the faint echoes, trying to decide whether we are truly part of a cycle or simply reading patterns into scattered evidence. Honestly, I do not mind the uncertainty. Uncertainty is where sleep lives. Certainty has sharp edges. Doubt is softer. It lets the mind rest without needing to win an argument. So let the trench be a room in your imagination. The boards are the walls. The clay is the floor. The lantern is your candle. Above you, the night is wide. And beneath you, deeper layers wait. Older than the oldest kings, older than the oldest written words. Beneath Woolley's flood layer are people we do not name. They left pottery with different shapes, different colors. They left traces that suggest ways of life we can only infer. And beneath them, deeper still, perhaps only sediments, or perhaps something else. We cannot be sure. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and the past is full of places we have not yet looked. Sometimes I imagine the seabeds, continental shelves drowned by rising oceans, Doggerland under the North Sea, the Persian Gulf Valley when sea levels were lower, Sunderland and its forests, places that might hold hearths, paths, post holes, maybe even monuments, all sealed under water and silt. Marine archaeology has begun to map some landscapes. Trawlers occasionally pull up, worked flint, carved bone, even human remains. But systematic excavation is still rare. It is expensive. It is slow. It is in its. And patience is the mood I want you to feel now, because the lesson of the seventh framing is not only that catastrophe happens, it is also that catastrophe happens on timescales that human institutions struggle to hold in mind. Thousands of years, millennia, intervals longer than the life of any empire, longer than the memory of any family line. longer than the lifespan of the languages we speak. Yet the threats are not only ancient, our age carries its own hazards, and this is where the story turns from deep past into something closer to your skin. The ancient catastrophes came from sky and sea and climate systems beyond human control. Our modern catastrophes include those, but they also include us. Climate change, driven by human activity, reshapes rainfall patterns, agricultural zones, coastlines. It is not identical to the Sahara's slow desiccation, but it rhymes with it. The planet dries in some places and floods in others. The timing is faster than many natural shifts. The consequences, if unmanaged, can cascade through food systems and migration pressures in ways the Bronze Age might recognize. Pandemic disease remains a shadow. Even with medicine, the world can be disrupted by something microscopic. And our dense interconnection, flights, cities, trade, makes spread easier. It is a strange comfort and a strange fear, knowing that the same network that brings food and medicine can also carry disruption. Asteroid impacts remain statistically certain on long time horizons. We now have telescopes and surveys and deflection proposals. That is new. It is one of the few places where knowledge might offer protection, but protection requires coordination, and coordination is a social technology, not just a physical one. Then there are threats no earlier civilization carried in its hands. Nuclear weapons, a capacity for sudden, self-inflicted ruin that compresses catastrophe into hours. Biotechnology that can create pathogens. Artificial intelligence systems that might pursue goals misaligned with human welfare if developed. Solar storms that could disable electrical infrastructure. All of these are categories of risk that feel modern, yet they share a trait with ancient catastrophes. They test resilience. And resilience, again and again, is about redundancy. The survivors of earlier disruptions benefited from diversity and separation. When one region failed, another could carry the thread. Modern civilization, in contrast, is globalized. Efficiency has replaced slack. Supply chains are long. Knowledge is stored in formats that require electricity and specialized devices. The library has become a server farm, humming behind fences. I have always felt a small sadness in that. A clay tablet can be read by candlelight. A digital archive cannot. We have gained scale and speed, yet we have made our memory dependent on fragile systems. So what do we do with this knowledge? Some people build seed vaults in cold mountains. Some build long-term archives meant to last centuries or millennia. Some carve messages in stone, or print books on durable paper, or store microfilm in caves. The Long Now Foundation speaks about deep time and the responsibility to think far ahead. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault holds the genetic heritage of crops. The Internet Archive tries to preserve the digital record. These are modern attempts at what Göbekli Tepe might have been, a deliberate act of. Still, it is easy to feel overwhelmed, and that is not what we want here. This is a sleep story. Fear is allowed to appear, but it must dissolve into calm. So we will shift the focus from danger to the simplest truth. Humans adapt. The people who lived through the younger Dryas cooling episode, whether driven by impact or by other climate mechanisms, adapted. They found shelter. They changed diets. They built monuments. Coastal communities displaced by rising seas moved inland. Farmers faced drought and moved toward rivers. Saharan pastoralists followed the retreating monsoon to the Nile and other water sources. Bronze Age cities shrank and people reorganized into smaller communities. The thread continued. You are that thread. Your existence is proof that someone survived, again and again, through long sequences of hardship, not because they were heroic in a storybook way, but because they were stubborn and practical, and capable of love even when resources were scarce. They carried babies. They shared food. They taught skills. They remembered. Now, as you listen, imagine the tiny movements that make memory durable. A hand pressing a reed into wet clay, a fingertip smoothing an edge, a breath warming cold hands before work continues, a mother humming a tune while grinding grain, a father marking the height of the river on a wall, a group gathering stones in a circle because the stars matter, because seasons matter, because ritual makes fear manageable. These are not grand moments. They are quiet, and quiet is where we are going. In Part 8, we will not chase new catastrophes. We will simply let the story settle into stillness. We will let the idea of cycles become a gentle rocking motion, like water under a boat. And we will end with the simplest promise the night can offer: rest. For now, let the trench fade. Let the lantern light soften. Let the clay layer become a smooth, cool surface beneath your thoughts. You can set down the weight of the world here. You can let your jaw loosen. You can let your shoulders drop. The past will keep existing whether you hold it or not. And you, tonight, are allowed to sleep. Before we move on, there is one more thing I want you to picture, because it explains why these stories cling to us even when we insist they are only myths. Imagine a museum at closing time. Lights dim one by one. Footsteps retreat down a corridor. A guard's keys jingle softly, then fade. In the cases, behind glass, clay tablets lie like sleeping insects, small rectangles of baked earth covered in wedge-shaped marks, cuneiform. You know that feeling when you stare at writing you cannot read, and it still feels like a voice? That is what those tablets do to me. They do not shout. They whisper. The Sumerian King List is one such whisper, copied and recopied by scribes who were themselves surrounded by ruins, by abandoned mounds, by the awareness that cities do not last. It begins with a claim that is both simple and impossible. Kingship descended from heaven. Then it names cities: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Separ, Shurapak, and it gives rulers reigns measured in lengths that feel like a dream trying to imitate a calendar, tens of thousands of years. Absurd, if you take it literally. Yet absurdity can be a kind of honesty, a way of saying, we do not know how long it was, only that it was far longer than a human life. After the flood, the list changes. The numbers shrink. They become less impossible, then merely improbable, then gradually settle into something closer to what we would call history. The shift is like watching a candle burn down. Tall flame, extravagant shadows. Then the wax runs and the light becomes practical. Some scholars argue those long reigns represent dynasties, not individuals. Others propose numerical coding, astronomical cycles, scribal conventions. It is debated, and we cannot be sure. The only thing we can say with confidence is that the scribes felt a boundary, before and after, a flood line across the mind. That is why Woolley's clean clay is so haunting, because it is a physical echo of a mental boundary. And that, maybe, is why so many cultures tell stories of worlds ending in different ways. Fire, water, wind, ice, plague, earthquake. The details vary, but the rhythm repeats. Even if these myths are not literal memories, they are emotional memories. They remember what it feels like when the ground rules change. Let that feeling soften now. In my mind, the trench and the museum are the same room. The clay layer is the glass case. The lantern is the exhibit light. The past lies there, silent, offering itself once. So when I say we are the seventh, I am not asking you to believe it as doctrine. I am inviting you to feel the pattern as a lullaby. Rise and fall. Breath in and breath out. A long sequence of nights and mornings across deep time. And in that lullaby, you do not have to solve anything. You can simply listen. Stay with that whisper for a moment longer. The candle does not need answers. It only needs air. And you, tonight only need permission to rest. Right here. Now. Now, if you are still awake, I want you to notice how the room feels when a story stops pushing and starts drifting. The fire has a way of doing that, even when it crackles. The sound is rounded, like it has been wrapped in cloth. The candle flame leans and straightens. Wax softens at the edge and slides down in slow, patient tears. Shadows breathe on the walls. Nothing urgent is happening. That is the first gift of night. So let us finish our walk through 6 endings, not by adding a 7th disaster, but by laying the whole sequence down like a long cloak and smoothing it flat. Fire from the sky, weather impact or some other sudden climatic jolt at the younger Dryas boundary. Sea levels rising until whole coastlines become legends. The 8.2 kiloyear cold snap, when rainfall patterns failed and early towns shrank. The Sahara turning from green to sand. A slow murder of a biome. The 4.2 kiloyear drought, when empires that felt permanent found their granaries empty. The mysterious narrowing of male lineages, whether driven by violence, social structure, drift, or disease, a quiet R. Each event is different. That matters. It means the universe is not a single repeating monster. It has many faces, and yet the response, for those who survived, often looks similar. Move, adapt, remember what you can, forget what you must, teach the young, share water, follow the river, make a new map with the same hands. I have always found that strangely comforting. Not because catastrophe is comforting, but because the act of continuing is so ordinary. Most survivors are not names on stone. They are people with cracked fingernails and tired eyes, people who hold a child on one hip and a bundle in the other arm, people who whisper stories at night because the story makes the dark feel organized. Maybe that is all a myth is, a way to make the dark into something you can sit beside. If you were standing here with me, you would hear the faintest sounds outside the house, a distant car, perhaps, a shifting branch, the soft settling of a building as temperature changes. These small noises are proof that the world is still moving, still doing its slow work. You do not have to manage it. You can let the world turn without you for a few hours. So let me take you back, one last time, to Woolley's trench at Ur. Not to debate, not to prove, but to feel the way a boundary looks when it is real. Clean clay, smooth in places, gritty in others. If you rub a pinch between your fingers, it holds together, then falls apart, tiny grains catching candlelight like dull stars. It smells faintly mineral, like wet stone left to dry. It has no shards, no human signature, only the signature of water settling and leaving silence behind. Above it, pottery. Below it, different pottery. A simple fact that carries an entire philosophy. One world can end, and the next world can reuse the same ground. We are always building on someone. Sometimes that thought makes people uneasy. It should not. It is just the natural order of time. Even your own day works this way. You fall asleep, and in the morning you wake and build again, as if the night were a small flood that erased the sharp edges. That is why I like these stories for sleep. They mirror what your body already knows. Cycles are not only doom. Cycles are also rest. In the same way, the idea of being the 7th civilization does not have to be a warning carved in granite. It can be a gentle reminder that our place in the line is not the first and will not be the last. Humility can be soothing. It lets you stop straining to be permanent. Some scholars argue that the pattern is overinterpreted, that discontinuities in the archaeological record do not necessarily equal global civilizational resets. That is fair. It is debated. The past is patchy. Sites erode, drown, get buried, get built over. Dating has uncertainty. Stories change. We cannot be sure of every link, but uncertainty does not erase the feeling of deep time. Deep time is the real character here. the slow, massive presence behind every temple and every ruin, the way it makes a human life feel brief, and yet, paradoxically, precious. Because if your life is brief, then your rest matters. Your small joys matter. A warm blanket, a safe room, a voice in the dark telling you that you do not have to hold the whole world. So let us let the world shrink down to the size of this moment. Notice your breathing. The air enters, cool at the tip of the nose, warmer as it moves inward. The chest rises. The belly rises. Then it all softens and releases. Again, slow, unforced. Notice your jaw. If it is clenched, even slightly, let it loosen, as if the muscles are remembering how to be heavy. Let your tongue rest. Let your shoulders settle. Not pulled down, just allowed to stop working. The firelight continues to flicker. The candle continues to burn. The story continues in the background of history, but you are not required to watch it. If your mind tries to chase the catastrophes, let it. Minds do that. They circle, but then offer it a smaller thing to hold. The sound of water in imagination. Not rushing, just breathing. The scent of clay. The hush of a museum at closing time. The simple image of numbers shrinking on a tablet, as if time itself were exhaling. One day, long from now, someone may look at the traces we leave. They may call us advanced or foolish, or both. They may find our bones under sediment, our plastic and metal in layers, our satellites fallen to dust. They may ask what destroyed us, or what saved us. That question does not belong to you tonight. Tonight belongs to the smallest continuity, a heartbeat, a breath, a quiet room. The past has ended many times, and still you are here. That is enough. Let the fireplace become a distant glow. Let the candlelight dim behind your eyelids. Let the museum doors close gently. Let the trench fill in, not with dirt, but with soft darkness, packed and safe. And before you fully let go, I want you to do something slow with you. Something like tracing a circle with a fingertip on a table until the mind stops asking where the circle begins. We will pass the 6 endings again, not as headlines, not as proof, just as landscapes. First, the sky. Picture a night so clear it hurts. Stars close enough to bruise your imagination. In that darkness, a bright line appears for a heartbeat. Some researchers argue a cosmic impact or airburst helped trigger the younger Dryas cooling. Other researchers dispute that interpretation. We cannot be sure. But imagine the human experience either way. A sudden flare, a strange sound that is not thunder, and then the long consequence, weeks and months, when the usual pattern refuses to return. Now, the stones at Göbekli Tepe, limestone pillars, tall and pale, carved without metal, hands blistered, rope biting into palms, dust in nostrils, dry as old breath. Whatever the purpose, sanctuary, warning, star map, the site tells us something simple. Humans respond to uncertainty by building something that outlasts them, and sometimes they even bury it carefully, as if tucking it under a blanket of soil. Then, water. Not a single wall, but the slow swallowing of the shore. Sea levels rising after ice sheets melt. A child walks with a grandparent along a beach, and the grandparent points and says, "The water used to stop there." Decades later, the child is old, and the water has moved again. Wells turn brackish. Storm surges push farther. Sacred places vanish under waves. Doggerland becomes a rumor. The Persian Gulf Valley becomes a sea. Somewhere, someone looks back from higher ground and watches the sun set over a plough. Then, climate betrayal. The 8.2 kiloyear event, recorded in ice and sediment. A sudden cooling linked to freshwater disrupting ocean circulation. The mechanism is studied and refined, but the lived experience would have been plain. The rains do not come. Seasons turn unreliable. Fields become dust. towns shrink. People move toward springs, lakes, and rivers, toward whatever still gives water without bargaining. Then, the Sahara. Try to imagine green where you have only ever seen sand, lakes, fish, cattle herders singing, rock art of animals that no longer live there. Then the monsoon retreats, vegetation thins, wind grows sharper, dust rises more easily from the ground. One generation remembers water, the next grows up without it. Refugees move toward the Nile, carrying sky knowledge and pastoral rhythms into a narrow corridor of survivable land. Then, the Bronze Age drought, the 4.2 kiloyear disruption, linked to dust and weakened rainfall, coinciding with collapses and upheavals. Granaries empty, trade routes break, tin does not arrive, bronze falters. Cities that felt permanent begin to feel hollow. The human stories inside that are small and quiet, a family packing grain into a basket and realizing it is not enough, a neighbor closing a door, a tired leader promising order, because order is the only thing left to promise. Then, the sixth transformation, the quiet one, a narrowing of Y chromosome diversity. The dramatic ratios you may hear are measures of effective population size, not a literal count. Scholars model mechanisms, clan warfare and patrilineal systems, reproductive inequality, social structure and drift, disease. It is debated, but imagine what it feels like, culturally, when lineages become everything, when inheritance and identity harden, and many lines end while a few continue, and from those survivors, writing, cities, empires rise again. So yes, if you want, you can call our age the seventh, or you can simply call it the current age, one more wave in a long sea. Either way, there is a gentle lesson. The world changes, and humans keep trying to live inside it. Now let me bring it closer. Think about how you store your own memories. A smell opens a corridor of time. A song makes a childhood room appear. Civilizations store memory the same way, only larger. In myths, in rituals, in temple doors, in seeds kept in jars, in archives built into mountains. Let your thoughts become like clay settling in water. At first, the water is cloudy, full of motion. If you stop stirring, the particles fall. They arrange themselves into a quiet layer, clean, smooth, free of sharp fragments. You do not have to excavate your own mind tonight. You can let the layers settle as they want to settle. If an image returns, the trench, the museum, the drowned shore, let it pass like a slow lantern slide. You can watch without gripping it. The night is here to hold it for you. And there is one more image I want to leave with you, because it ties the deep past to the quiet present. Picture a small archive, not grand, not cinematic, a shelf in a cool room, a box that holds seeds wrapped in paper, a book printed on thick pages, a map drawn by hand, maybe a simple tool, a needle, a whetstone, things that do not need electricity to explain themselves. I find comfort in that kind of simplicity. Resilience is mostly a habit of keeping a little extra, a habit of redundancy, a habit of teaching someone else how to do the thing you can do. So knowledge does not live in one skull only. When I imagine the survivors of those earlier ages, I do not imagine heroes posing on cliffs. I imagine people doing small repairs, rebinding a basket, mending a net, sharpening a blade, walking to a spring with a clay jar, and listening for frogs, repeating the same motions until the body learns them, until the mind grows quiet inside them. And that is what sleep can be for you now. A small repair, a gentle reset, not a catastrophe, just a soft boundary line between days. So let the circle complete itself. Let the sky, the stones, the water, the drought, the dust, the narrowing of lineages all become distant, as if you are turning down the volume on a radio. The story is still there. It simply does not need to be loud, in and out. If you notice a thought, that wants to argue, let it drift. If you notice a thought that wants to worry, let it drift too. Tonight you can meet tomorrow rested. Stay with the simplest things: breath, warmth, the weight of your body on whatever supports you, the small hush that arrives when you stop trying to solve the world. And when you are ready, when your eyelids feel heavy and the room feels far away, you can let the last images fade into plain darkness, the kind of darkness that does not threaten, only covers, like soil over a buried sanctuary, like water over a drowned plain, like clay settling into a clean layer. Let brow smooth. Let your hands unclench. Let night do its quiet work. I will stay here a little longer, watching the flame, listening to the night settle its weight over everything. And as you drift, I will speak the oldest blessing I know, the one that asks nothing of you except sleep. Good night.